In 1985, when the first camera crossed the threshold of the Titanic's first-class dining saloon, the exploration team fell completely silent. The shelves still held the meticulously stacked china. The crystal glasses remained untouched. The floor was covered in sediment, but the structure stood perfectly intact. It was as if the cleanup from April 15, 1912, had simply been paused. But no one ever came back. For 73 years, that door remained shut at the bottom of the Atlantic. And when it was finally opened, what the explorers saw wasn't just a snapshot of the past. The scene inside directly contradicts the company's official records of what truly happened at the end of that night. The Titanic's first-class dining saloon wasn't on the upper decks, where the elite usually strolled during the day. It was located down on D-deck. It was the deepest social space on the ship. It was designed specifically to isolate the passengers from the constant roar of the engines, creating an oasis of tranquility in the middle of the ocean. By the strict standards of the era, it was a triumph of engineering and naval architecture. It was the largest dining room ever conceived on an ocean liner up to that point. There was enough space to seat 550 passengers all at once. The room was entirely paneled in heavy white oak. The warm light reflected off the large arched windows, which served to mask the harsh steel structure of the hull and create the illusion of a palace on solid ground. On the floor, a thick, soft Axminster carpet muffled the hurried sound of heels and leather shoes. During meals, the ship's orchestra filled that colossal space with a continuous soundtrack of pure sophistication. On the night of April 14, 1912, the opulent dinner had already come to an end. The titans of industry and the European aristocracy had left their tables. Most went up to the exquisite smoking room to play cards and discuss business through the cigar smoke. Others retired to the reading room or walked along the open decks, staring into the absolute darkness of the North Atlantic under a star-studded sky with no moon in sight. The dining room, then, was handed over to its true workforce. Far from the eyes of the passengers, the room was being meticulously broken down and prepped for the morning. The waiters, already exhausted after hours of flawless service, gathered the crystal glasses. They stacked the heavy porcelain plates on the small shelves in the staging areas. The work was mechanical, silent, and highly choreographed. The linen tablecloths needed to be perfectly aligned for breakfast. Have you ever felt that sudden chill down your spine when something abnormal breaks the rhythm of a perfectly controlled environment? That is exactly what happened when the ship's clock struck 11:40 p.m. The collision was not what the movies usually show. There was no deafening crash in the luxury areas. What those workers felt deep down on D-deck was a continuous muffled vibration, a long dark scrape along the side, happening completely underwater, dozens of feet below the line of sight. The mountain of ice scratched the right flank of the ship almost imperceptibly. The waiters who were folding napkins and aligning the chairs felt the floor tremble beneath the thick carpet. The glasses shook slightly on the silver trays. They stopped. They exchanged confused looks, trying to make sense of that slight jolt in the four-funneled giant of steel. The ship kept gliding through the dark water. The routine just seemed to pause. They didn't know it yet, but the liner's fate was already sealed in that freezing darkness. The breakfast they were organizing with such dedication would never be served, and the half-finished work they left on those tables would remain exactly like that, untouched and swallowed by the salt water. If you value serious historical preservation and want to understand the details the official reports tried to hide, I invite you to like this documentary and subscribe to our channel. Following the true investigation demands that we look at what was left behind in the most complete darkness. And that is exactly where our analysis turns right now. The calendar marked the month of September in the year 1985. 73 years of absolute darkness and relentless silence had passed since the last light of the four-funneled giant faded in the North Atlantic. Over 2 miles away from any ray of sunlight on the muddy ocean floor, the massive bow of the ship rested in solemn silence. As naval engineering has shown, the vessel was first swallowed by the front, suffering a brutal collapse on the surface that tore it in half, before the heavy stern also met its fate in the freezing waters. It was in this setting of absolute desolation that the expedition led by oceanographer Robert Ballard made history. The team didn't send divers. The crushing pressure at nearly 12,500 feet deep would make that impossible. Instead, they sent down Argo. It was a remotely operated submersible vehicle, equipped with powerful floodlights and video cameras. When the submersible finally approached the ghostly steel structure, it navigated carefully toward the old social spaces. Argo's camera crossed the steel border and entered the D-deck section. The light pierced the murky water. It illuminated the space that, in the past, served as the dazzling first-class dining saloon. At that exact moment, in the surface control room, the entire team held their breath. What appeared on the small monochrome screens defied human intuition about major maritime disasters. There was no twisted chaos, the kind you would expect from a 46,000-ton structure plummeting to the ocean floor. Quite the opposite. What the lenses revealed was a time capsule frozen in a state of tidiness that was almost disturbing. The powerful spotlights illuminated the metal service shelves leaning against the saloon walls. There, the heavy, White Star Line porcelain dishes rested. They were not shattered. They were not scattered across the floor by a violent rush of water. They remained strictly stacked. How was this physically possible against all odds during an event of such magnitude? The organization of those stacks told a deafeningly silent story about the final minutes of that room. The freezing ocean water did not invade the dining room like a destructive wave. It rose through the floor of D-deck slowly, steadily, and almost methodically. It filled the room without creating current strong enough to knock over the stacks of plates. The water simply embraced the dishes. It preserved the final touch of the waiters' hands who stacked them on the night of April 14th, 1912. Around those shelves, the floor and the remaining structures were covered by a thick gray blanket. It was the so-called marine snow. It is a fine sediment that slowly falls from the upper zones of the ocean. In the dining saloon, this sediment formed a uniform, thick, and untouched layer over everything. This uniformity brought a valuable technical revelation. During its more than 7 decades of rest, the saloon had remained isolated from the external ocean currents. That space became a closed environment, shielded against the aggressive forces of the abyss. Faced with such a sacred scene, Robert Ballard made a decision that defined the ethics of his expedition. He ordered the submersible operators to keep the mechanical arm inactive. No metal claw should touch those dishes. Not a single object would be removed from the saloon to be brought back to the sunlight. For Ballard, preservation outweighed collection. He saw that space not as an ordinary archaeological site, but as the final resting place of hundreds of people. Everything had to remain exactly where the crew had left it. We can visualize, for a brief moment of pause, the external magnitude of this scene. A massive steel castle devoured by rust, totally submerged in the eternal night, holding inside it incredibly tidy rooms that would never see the day again. Ballard's stance on preservation was commendable. It went down in history as an act of profound respect. But there is a point of tension that cannot be ignored by anyone analyzing those old monitor images. Ballard decreed that the saloon should not be touched based on what the spotlights illuminated. He backed away. But what exactly did the light touch on those more hidden shelves or in the adjacent access doors that justified such an immediate and absolute order to stay away? What was seen for just a few seconds before the camera rotated away? To understand the real reason that turns this saloon into a focal point of concealment, we need to leave the bottom of the sea for a moment. We need to look at the exact records of what was scheduled to be served the very next morning. To grasp the magnitude of what was left submerged in the dark, we first need to look at the small pieces of paper that survived the tragedy. We know exactly what was consumed in the dining saloon on the night of April 14th, 1912, because some passengers, out of pure chance or whim, kept the menus in their pockets and purses before getting into the lifeboats. The first-class menu was an absolute display of power and refinement from the White Star Line. It was a rigorous banquet, consisting of 11 distinct courses served in a perfectly orchestrated cadence. The meal began with fresh oysters and a delicate consommé. Then, it moved on to poached salmon, perfectly seared filet mignon, roasted duck, tender cuts of lamb, asparagus served in a special sauce, and generous slices of foie gras. All of this culminated in a traditional dessert pudding. All this opulence is fascinating, without a doubt. It is widely documented in official history and in museums around the world. But pay close attention now, because we have reached the true bridge of this investigation. The element that transforms the history of this saloon does not lie in the dishes that were served to the millionaires. The answer is in what never made it to the tables. Behind the saloon's majestic oak doors lay the ship's massive kitchens and pantries. The operational logs from that night reveal a crucial detail about the crew's routine. While the freezing water was already starting to invade the lower compartments of the bow, far away from there, the kitchen staff was operating on a continuous shift. The ingredients and portions for the vast breakfast on April 15th had already been separated. The meats, the breads, and the morning prep work were organized on the counters and in the cold rooms. There was prepared food that never crossed the doorway. There was an entire logistical operation, pulsing and alive, that was paralyzed the exact moment the steel giant suffered that lateral scrape. And it began, almost imperceptibly, to tilt its nose down into the depths. We can pause and look at the ship from the outside for a moment. The pitch black of the night in the North Atlantic, contrasting with the black hull and its 4 funnels, still imposing against the stars. The giant still seemed unshakable, gliding through the cold water, while inside the backstage of a floating palace was entering a continuous and silent collapse. And it is exactly as we cross back into the interior of this ship that we hit the historical blind spot, the climax of this documentary concealment. When the commercial expeditions that followed Robert Ballard returned to the ocean floor in the following years, they didn't just observe the shelves from afar. The modern submersibles, equipped with articulated robotic arms and fiber optic microcameras, pushed past the limits of the dining saloon. They penetrated the service areas and the isolated pantries of D-Deck. These teams saw the real state of the prep counters. They illuminated the remnants of what would have been breakfast. They documented what the ocean had done to the kitchen's internal structure over so many decades. But unlike the iconic and exhaustively repeated images of the bow, these specific photographic records vanished from the public eye. RMS Titanic Incorporated, the company that secured the exclusive salvage rights and physical possession of the ship, classified the inventory of the kitchens and pantries under a very peculiar legal label. They called it internally documented. That is a cold, technical term. In practice, it means the visual and physical material was cataloged by the company and archived on their servers, but deliberately kept out of reach from the press and the independent scientific community. Why would a corporation suppress visual records of a simple service area on the ship? What kind of artifact? Or what structural condition was revealed on the other side of that door to make the company prefer to lock the discovery away in its own vaults? The original decision for preservation made by Robert Ballard was respected by him alone. But the bottom of the sea is a territory without borders and, unfortunately, without absolute owners. Starting in the year 1987, the isolation of that environment was definitively broken. Commercial expeditions, organized by RMS Titanic Incorporated, returned to the exact coordinates of the tragedy. And this time, the submersibles didn't just carry powerful video cameras, they carried long mechanical claws, The machines crossed the invisible line of respect and physically invaded the dining saloon. What was once a melancholic and untouched time capsule suddenly turned into an extraction field. Records prove that the teams removed dozens of artifacts from that specific environment. Fine white star line, porcelain, silver cutlery stained by decades of salinity, heavy fragments of the Axminster carpet, and even delicate decorative oak panels were ripped from the darkness and hoisted back to the surface. Many of these items were carefully cleaned, restored, and placed under the bright lights of traveling exhibitions that toured the entire globe. Millions of people paid expensive tickets to look through glass cases at a plate that, on the night of the disaster, was simply waiting for breakfast. But the true history, the one that requires a more mature look, lies precisely in what was not in those glass display cases. The complete inventory of everything extracted from the dining saloon throughout the 1990s was never published in a fully transparent way. What the general public saw and applauded represented only a small, carefully selected fraction of what was actually pulled from the depths. To understand the monumental scale of this ship, the weight of its engineering, and the detailed cataloging of the objects the ocean has kept, requires a deep dive far beyond commercial narratives. For those seeking the complete and documented truth, we highly recommend reading the digital book, The Anatomy of the Giant Titanic. It is an impressive visual and investigative guide with over 100 pages of unreleased diagrams, records, and facts that history has tried to dilute. The link to purchase this definitive work is right down below in the first pinned comment, and it is precisely regarding the custody of this material past that the scenario becomes even more alarming. Today, independent researchers know that there are artifacts originating from the dining saloon lost in confidential private collections around the world. The exact origin of these pieces and the silent path they took between the restoration labs and the private vaults were never tracked publicly. The historical chain of custody, which should guarantee that the ship's memory belongs to humanity, was slowly shattered. This breakdown reached its most critical point in the year 2016. The very corporation holding the exclusive exploration rights plunged into a complex legal bankruptcy process. Its internal archives, the unreleased inventories, and the recovered pieces became bargaining chips in a long, cold courtroom dispute. That sacred space deep in the Atlantic was invaded, and parts of it were taken away. And the secrets extracted from there ended up locked away once again. But now, not by the crushing natural force of saltwater, but by the power of confidential contracts on dry land. Technology has advanced relentlessly over the last few decades. If in the 80s, humanity relied on grainy images and small, trembling beams of light to see the bottom of the sea, in the year 2023, the Magellan Company achieved a feat of Titanic proportions, using unmanned submersibles and rigorous photogrammetric capture work. They completed the first full-size, millimeter-resolution, three-dimensional scan of the entire ship. It was a job so colossal and visually stunning that its images formed the investigative baseline for the National Geographic documentary released in the year 2025. Not a single drop of water obscured the view. Modern computer models removed the ocean from the equation, allowing researchers to digitally walk through the wreckage. And when these virtual lenses crossed the boundary of D-Deck, entering the once luxurious dining saloon, the absolute clarity brought with it a ruthless sentence. What the scan revealed was not a cause for technical relief or pure aesthetic contemplation. It was the visual diagnosis of a terminal collapse. The majestic steel walls that always protected the service areas and the dish shelves are in a state of accelerated destruction. The three-dimensional model highlighted the tireless and entirely silent work of extreme biological colonies. Billions of iron-eating bacteria are quite literally devouring the vessel's structural integrity. They are turning thousands of tons of the purest Edwardian-era steel into fragile, long formations of rust. Heavy structures, which once supported the strength of a floating palace, are now crumbling into oxidized dust, with the slightest shift in the ocean current. The speed of this organic degradation is so aggressive that naval engineers have reached a very grim conclusion. In less than 20 years, the crushing pressure of the seafloor will definitively conquer the weakened metal. The ceiling of the dining saloon, that very ceiling that reflected the warm light from the opulent crystal chandeliers on the night of April 14th, 1912, is going to completely cave in, forever crushing whatever still remains on the floorboards. We can witness the undeniable march of time over that historical environment, the silent, almost sacred order that the first expedition witnessed with its own eyes in the year 1985 will definitively not exist in the year 2045. The giant built in Belfast will cease to be a ship with recognizable corridors. It will slowly become just a long stain of collapsed ore on the ocean floor. The sea, in its absolute coldness, has taken control to shut down the narrative once and for all, slowly erasing the last physical traces that the impact with the ice merely began to destroy. And it is exactly here that the tension of our investigation reaches a critical limit of urgency. The historic wooden door to the dining saloon was opened decades ago. We know, through documents and physical materials, that crucial fragments of that last morning are still kept in the deepest areas of the kitchen and on the old support shelves. There is vital information and highly silent artifacts that could fill in the missing pieces of the story, covering the holes left by the suppressed documentation of the commercial exploration. But the central problem is that all of this is disintegrating much faster than our current ability to record the facts. The door to the absolute truth has been unlocked. That is a fact. But the floor and the ceiling on the other side are collapsing day by day. They threaten to grind down, under thousands of tons of corroded steel, the secrets that survived more than a century of deep darkness. The complete images of this imminent structural collapse, however, do not rest in public galleries or in free-access university archives. And here, we reach the final and darkest layer of concealment surrounding the history of D-Deck. The impressive three-dimensional scan, completed in the year 2023, generated the most perfect digital replica of the vessel ever conceived. The once sumptuous dining saloon, along with its mysterious adjacent service areas, was mathematically mapped in millimeter resolution. The precision of the equipment was so surgical that technicians managed to distinguish small debris and forgotten plates in areas that were physically inaccessible even to the smallest robotic submersibles. The ship was, in essence, rescued from the bottom of the sea in the form of pure data. Part of this magnificent visual survey was released for the major documentary productions that captivated global audiences. But the key word in this entire disclosure process is exactly that: part. The technology company that led and financed the massive ocean operation maintains absolute corporate control and image rights over the complete three-dimensional model. When dedicated oceanographers, maritime historians, and independent researchers tried to request unrestricted access to the files in their maximum resolution, driven by the need to analyze the true state of the hidden pantries and the kitchen machinery before it all turns to dust, the answer they received was not an embrace of open science. The scholars were politely redirected to the licensing channels and commercial acquisition departments. The raw memory of the ship became, quite coldly, a financial asset. Take a pause and look at the exact weight of this historical irony. The most investigated dining room in modern navigation, the exact place where the choreography of hard labor was interrupted by the scrape of the ice, has all its secrets properly documented. The images proving what was left behind the scenes of the first-class kitchens, far from the eyes of the millionaires, exist today, at this very second, in unquestionable clarity. This photogrammetric evidence is no longer fighting against the abyssal darkness or the crushing power of salt water. They are neatly organized and preserved in silence on the servers of a private corporation. In the month of September, in the year 1985, the inhospitable nature of the North Atlantic allowed humanity to finally shine a light inside that saloon. Decades later, cutting-edge technology immortalized every millimeter of that decaying scene for the future. But the definitive documentary, Truth About the Night of the Tragedy, remains a strictly restricted privilege. The barrier that currently prevents the world from understanding the totality of what was left behind is no longer made of over 12,000 feet of freezing ocean. The barrier, 114 years later, is built entirely out of exclusivity contracts. On the night of April 14, 1912, the Titanic's immense and majestic first-class dining saloon was no longer a stage for the aristocracy or the great fortunes of Europe. In those final hours, under the warm lighting that masked the freezing cold of the North Atlantic, it had transformed into the true essence of hard labor. Far from the eyes of the public now resting in their luxurious cabins, the exhausted waiters and the silent support staff gathered the heavy silver trays. They stacked the delicate, white star-line porcelain dishes on the small service shelves with impressive agility. They prepped the room with almost military precision for the majestic breakfast to be served the next day. They folded the linen napkins. They perfectly aligned each chair over the thick Axminster carpet. And suddenly, in the middle of that flawless choreography, the steel floor trembled slightly beneath their leather shoes. Those anonymous workers never finished their meticulous setup, while the upper deck plunged into absolute chaos, with lifeboats leaving at half capacity and the orchestra playing its final melody to try and calm the terror. Down below, on D-deck, the tragedy took on a tone of relentless silence. The freezing water, at 28 degrees Fahrenheit, rose lethally through the lower compartments. It did not invade the dining room, violently destroying structures. It simply embraced the tables and swallowed the work of that night, sealing the room in the purest darkness under the crushing pressure of the oceanic abyss. For 73 long continuous years, at exactly 12,415 feet deep, that access door remained strictly closed. Silence took over what was once the most opulent and vibrant place on the largest and most famous ocean liner in the world. And when that door was finally illuminated by the powerful light beams of the submersibles in the 1980s, what the explorers found made a profound impact. The scene inside brought an incredibly melancholic revelation about the nature of the disaster. The steel colossus had sunk exactly the same way it had lived, maintaining an unshakable order, with the shelves tidy, with the glasses intact in their holders, with everything strictly in its proper place. Everything in that gigantic saloon was prepared for a tomorrow that simply did not arrive. The dining saloon is still down there. It rests in pitch black, but it now fights a final battle against mankind's destiny and time itself, consumed by colonies of bacteria in its final years before the complete collapse of the structure. The physical door, once shielded by the ocean, was opened. The robotic micro-cameras crossed the old wooden threshold. The entire space was swept by state-of-the-art lasers and scanned in 3 dimensions with millimeter precision. But the true essence of that night, the definitive answer still resting in the isolated pantries, the exact documentation of what was not served, and the raw history of those men who left the tables half-finished, remain withheld. 114 years later, the most intimate mystery of D-Deck remains untouchable, out of reach for those who wish to understand the tragedy in its entirety. The deep ocean proved to be a strict museum. It preserved pocket watches stopped at exactly 2:28 in the morning. It preserved shoes in pairs across the vast debris field, guarding forever the invisible shapes of lives that vanished in the dark. The sea was a relentless guardian. But the barrier preventing us from accessing the full story today is no longer made of salt water and brutal pressure. The door was thrown wide open by investigative courage and human technology, but the memory was locked away again by closed contracts and private commercial interests. The sea kept the ship safe for over a century, but it was our own era that decided to privatize and hide its most painful history. Reflecting on the past requires a mature, analytical, and profound look, one that does not settle for half-truths or narratives edited for the masses. If you believe that documentary, historical memory deserves to be treated with respect, rigor, and honesty, please leave a like on this video and subscribe to the channel. Our relentless search for the facts that silence tries to erase continues until our next investigation.